Hey guys, welcome back to Cloud Tech Services. We had started with a series of Azure tutorials for beginners, and this is the second video of that series. In today's video, we are going to talk about virtualization and nested virtualization concepts in Azure. For this video, we will start exploring the concepts of virtualization and then move to the types of virtualization. Then we will look into the concepts of nested virtualization and how to enable nested virtualization on Azure virtual machines. Once we are done through the concepts, we will look into a quick demo to perform virtualization. So let's get started. Virtualization is a method to separate service from a physical machine. It is a process to create a virtual version of something similar to a physical machine like a computer hardware. Virtualization concept is used to not just create virtual representations of physical computers, it is also used to create virtual representation of other physical devices such as servers, storage devices and network devices. The technique of virtualization allows user to create and run multiple virtual machines on a single physical machine. The most unique concept of virtualization is that it allows the user to share the hardware resources of the physical machine with multiple separate virtual environments. Let's understand this using a simple diagrammatic representation. The picture here shows the hardware architecture of the concept of virtualization. As I explained earlier, virtualization allows to share physical infrastructure among virtual environment. In the diagram here, the first level or the lowermost layer is the physical infrastructure. The physical infrastructure will consist of physical devices such as hard disks, network devices, storage devices, and physical computers like servers and workstations. The cloud service providers like Microsoft and Azure Web Services maintain huge data centers that contain such extensively hosted physical machine and other hardware devices which are available to users like us for virtualization. On top of the physical infrastructure is the host operating system that allows users to interact with the underlying hardware. The host operating system is not compulsory. At some cases, this can be optional. But you can find the host operating system in the second layer just above the physical infrastructure. To enable virtualization on any physical infrastructure, there is a unique technology that is specifically created. That is called as the hypervisor, which you will find on the third layer. Hypervisors are generally installed over the host operating system. This allows us to develop and create several virtual environments within the physical machine. We will look into the installation and configuration of the software, that is the hypervisor software, in our demo. Once the hypervisor is installed on top of the physical infrastructure, we are now ready to perform with our virtualization. So now in the diagram you will see that there are three different VMs created. VM is the abbreviation for virtual machines. As per the diagram, you will find each virtual machine has its own guest operating system, its own libraries and own applications that is hosted on those virtual machines. The virtual machines are separate entities in themselves, and they all share the underlying hardware physical infrastructure. So it is possible that virtual machine 1 has the guest operating system of Windows and IIS server is running on that particular application, and virtual machine 2 has the guest operating system of Linux with some application running on it. Without specifically creating any network interaction, both the virtual machines would be separate entities running on their own without any interaction amongst themselves, and they would share a single physical infrastructure. So I hope by now you would have understood the use of virtualization. But before moving ahead to other concepts, it is very important to understand why the concept of virtualization evolved. What are the benefits of virtualization? Virtualization has mainly four benefits. The first one being resource efficiency. So let's consider this with an example. Let's suppose you have a physical machine which has a RAM capacity of 64 gigabytes. If you yourself use that particular physical machine without giving access to anybody else, there is high possibility that you alone won't be able to consume the entire 64 gigs memory at a time. But with the concept of virtualization, you can allow more than one user to access this system and create their own smaller virtual environments within your physical infrastructure. And then with their smaller virtual environments, there is a possibility of consuming the 64 gigs RAM. If virtualization wasn't there in the picture, the utilization of this resource wouldn't have been to the fullest. So this is one of the greater examples of virtualizations, the benefits of virtualizations. The second benefit of using virtualization is easier management. The concept of virtualizations makes the life of administrators easy when it comes to managing applications and software. Let's take another example to understand this. Let's suppose there is an administrator who needs to implement automated policies on machines. When deploying a virtual infrastructure, what he can simply do is he can include the automated collection creation policy with the software template using which he is deploying the virtual machines. So when the virtual infrastructure comes up, the administrator doesn't have to perform manual steps for adding the device to the collection. Because the step was already included in the software template, when the machine comes up, it would automatically be part of the collection that the administrator wants it to. The third advantage of using virtualization is minimal downtime. Downtime is referred to as the time period during which an application or a service becomes unavailable to the user. Operating system crashes, application crashes can cause downtime and disrupt services. But with virtualization, admins can run redundant virtual machines alongside the production machines so that if there is a failure experienced, the load can fail over from the production machine to the disaster recovery and backup systems. With virtualization, the maintenance of the disaster recovery environment becomes cost efficient as running multiple physical servers becomes far more expensive. Faster provisioning is another greater benefit of using virtualization. Generally, when physical machines provisioning is done, buying, installing and consuming hardware is time consuming. But same is not the case with virtual machines if the hardware is already in place. Now let's move towards looking into the different types of virtualization. See in the image, there are basically 6 types of virtualization. Application virtualization, network virtualization, desktop virtualization, storage virtualization, server and data virtualization. So starting with the first one, that is application virtualization. Now application virtualizations are used where we want to make applications available to users. There are applications that can have personal information and other characteristics stored on a server. But the application can also run on a local workstation through the internet. Let's suppose there is an application. Let's take an example of Gmail. So that particular application is hosted somewhere on a physical server. All the information like user information and other like the Gmail database and everything is stored on a specific server. But then you can also install the Gmail application on your local machine and then access it or access the Gmail application through the browser. This is an example of application virtualization. Some examples that come under application virtualization would include hosted applications or packaged applications. The second type of virtualization is called as network virtualization. By the name itself, you can understand that if we are intending to use a network and its characteristics, then it is called as network virtualization. So basically, the ability to run multiple virtual networks with separate control and data plan for each network in itself is called as the network virtualization. The virtual network resides on the physical machine and it uses the physical network. But each individual virtual network has a separate entity. Like two virtual networks will not intercommunicate with each other unless specifically configured for. This facility also provides users a facility to create and provision virtual network, logical switches, load balancers, VPNs, etc. So all the concepts that I talked about, like load balancers, switches, VPNs, that are configured on the cloud platform, use the concept of network virtualization. The third and the most extensively used virtualization type is the desktop virtualization. The desktop virtualization basically allows users to remote access the operating system virtually over the internet. So if we are creating any virtual machines and we are hosting virtual machines on cloud platform on Hyper-Vs, then that category comes under desktop virtualization. The fourth kind of virtualization is the storage virtualization. When we use the cloud environment to store data, when we use the cloud environment to create virtual storage systems, that comes under storage virtualization. So if we are creating some sort of virtual hard disks, attaching it to the virtual machines, such categories, or if we are creating, let's suppose, blob storage, or we are creating file shares, then such are the categories, like those are the categories that come under storage virtualization. Then comes the fifth category, that is the server virtualization. So in server virtualization, the masking of the server resources takes place. So the central server is divided into multiple different servers. Each different server has their different operating systems, but they are all located on the same physical server. So that is called as server virtualization. And then last but not the least is the data virtualization. So if data is being collected from various sources and is kept at a single place without the users having the knowledge as to how the data is being collected, how is it being stored, how the formatting is being done. So that is the concept of data virtualization. So after talking about all the types of virtualization, it is now very important to understand what is the application that is being used to perform all the virtualizations. So Microsoft's virtualization product that Microsoft has launched, and it uses this particular product to perform virtualization. That product is called as Hyper-V. So to perform virtualization on Windows operating systems, the software that we need to install on the operating system is called as Hyper-V. This software is available on Windows 10 or 11 device. It is also available on Windows Server operating system as well. This software application basically allows the virtualization to be done. So if we want to enable virtualization on any physical infrastructure and the physical infrastructure is running either Windows 10 or Windows 11 operating system, or it is running Windows Server operating system, then the application that we can use that is suggested by Microsoft is the Hyper-V. Some of the features that are there in Hyper-V that we would see moving ahead are like computing environment, disaster recovery. So Hyper-V can be used to build a computing environment. It gives us an opportunity to develop a disaster recovery environment. The Hyper-V is highly portable. It can be optimized as per our needs. We can remotely connect to the machines that are hosted on the Hyper-V environment and use it. And there are some like security aspects also that Microsoft handles when devices are there on the Hyper-V. Now that we are clear about the concepts of virtualization, it becomes a lot easy to understand what nested virtualization is. And why are we talking about nested virtualization in Azure? So Azure, as you might know, is basically like it is a cloud platform. So whatever functionalities or whatever features that we get in Azure, all of those functions and features, they are basically built on the concept of virtualization. So if we are using any service of Azure directly, that is, if we are using virtual machines, if we are using virtual networks and things like that, then we are already using virtualization on Azure. When we talk about nested virtualization, by definition, it means that creating a virtual machine inside an existing virtual machine. That is the concept of nested virtualization. It is similar to something like the concept of a nested loop. If we have a for loop, and then inside that for loop, if we have a while loop, then that concept is called as nested looping. Similarly, if we have a virtual machine and we enable that virtual machine, and inside that virtual machine we create another virtual machine, or inside that particular virtual machine we create sets of virtual machines, then that is called as nested virtualization. Now, it is very important to understand that nested virtualization is not supported on all the Azure virtual machines. There are some of the series of Azure virtual machines on which the nested virtualization is supported. And the capacity of the virtualization, like what type of virtualization it will support and all of that, depends on the series that has been opted for. Some of the series that are used for virtualization is the D series, V3, V4, V5. You can see, and there is a list of capacities of the series where you can find which series supports nested virtualization and which doesn't. Now, before moving ahead and creating nested virtualization, like looking into the actual demo of nested virtualization on Azure, we should be aware of the best practices that needs to be followed. So there are three categories of best practices: installation best practices, configuration, and networking. So when we talk about installation best practices, this simply means how we should install the hypervisor and how we should install virtual machines on the hypervisor. So the first and the most important thing is to check the default VM settings. It is generally suggested that since Microsoft has developed hypervisor, the default settings are the most secure settings. So it should be preferred to follow the default settings while performing the installation. The second most important thing is to understand how to use the right storage system. Microsoft recommends not to install the virtual machine, not to configure the virtual machine to have the hard disk on the operating system drive of the physical machine. So whenever the storage is being configured for the virtual machine, that should be kept in mind. And then it also looks into how the operating system is being managed. So that is also another very critical point that should be kept in mind when we are going with the installation best practices. Once the installation has been done for Hyper-V, now it's important to understand the configuration best practices. So Microsoft recommends that whenever a user is creating a virtual machine, they should use the feature of the dynamic memory. It's not necessary, but this is something that is enabled by default. On the lab environments, we can enable it or we can disable it, but this is something that is recommended by Microsoft. It also recommends to understand the difference between VHD and VHDX. And then consider generation 2 virtual machines over generation 1. So when virtual machines is being created, which we will see in our demo, we have an option to select what generation virtual machine we want to create. And Microsoft suggests to select generation 2 over generation 1. And then close the unnecessary windows that might be open to just avoid confusion when we are performing the configuration. When we talk about networking, the first thing is that Microsoft suggests right now is to use IPv6 over IPv4. But for lab purposes, we generally use IPv4 environment. It also suggests to not create many virtual switches so that it avoids the confusion regarding which switch is being used for communication, what kind of switches are being used, how the network is being divided and all of that. So it suggests to avoid creating many virtual switches, and then it also suggests to implement the Hyper-V network monitoring so that in case of any security breaches through that Hyper-V or the virtualized environment, the admins who have built that environment are aware of it. Let's see the demo of an example of a nested virtualization. So right now on the screen, you can see that I have created a virtual machine. The virtual machine is running currently. The location is Central India. And my virtual machine size is D4ADS V5. So I have a DV5 series virtual machine. So let's log into the machine. So this is the virtual machine right now, which I have. Let me take you to the machine properties just to check the machine name. So this is the machine right now, which is a test machine, and the installed RAM is 16 GB. I have installed a Windows 10 Enterprise version. You can use either Windows 10 Pro or Education, or even prefer Windows Server. So this is an Azure virtual machine. So the underlying physical infrastructure would be on somewhere on the Azure data center, and that has made this machine available to me. So this is the first layer of virtualization that I am using as an interface. On this machine, I will go ahead and install the Hyper-V to enable nested virtualization on the Azure VM. To enable Hyper-V, I will first turn on the hypervisor feature that is present. So if you check the Windows features on and off settings, you can find the Hyper-V settings here. Inside this, you would find the Hyper-V management tools and the Hyper-V platform. So I will just click on OK. And this will search for the required files, and it will start downloading the required files from the internet or from the operating system to install Hyper-V on the virtual machine. So let's give it a few minutes, and while the changes are applying. Once the Hyper-V gets installed on the virtual machine, then we will take a look as to how we can download and install a new virtual machine inside this Azure virtual machine. So let's restart this machine, and we will come back once the machine has been restarted. Now after restart, we have taken the RDP of that machine. So let's search for the Hyper-V. So you will find two options when you search for the Hyper-V. The first one is the Hyper-V Quick Create, and the second one is the Hyper-V. So we will Hyper-V Manager. So we will just open the manager here. So this is the application which will allow us to start with start creating a virtual machine inside another virtual machine. So this is the test VM Hyper-V virtual server, and inside this server we can create several virtual machines. So I have downloaded an operating system image of Windows 10. So I'll just go ahead and create a new virtual machine. For the installation of the virtual machine, as we saw, that it's best to leave all the recommendations to the default settings. So we'll start. So this is the first page for the wizard. So we'll just click on next. I'll just give this name as let's give it VM01, and by default it's stored in inside program data. If you want, you can change this location. So just for easy management, I'll just create a new folder here. I'll just name it VMs, and I will keep all the virtual machine hard disks inside that. So I'll just go ahead, select this folder. So this is selected right now. I'll click next. Another recommendation was to use generation 2 virtual machine over generation 1. So I'll just click on generation 2, move ahead to next. Since I'm installing Windows 10 operating system, so I'll just give minimum of 2 gigs. And I will use dynamic memory. So when we use dynamic memory, let's suppose during the installation or somewhere down the line while using the operating system, if the operating system needs more memory than it is assigned, and if the dynamic memory usage option is enabled, then it will automatically use the amount of extra memory that it requires from the virtual host machine, if the host machine has free memory. If we do not use this, then the virtual machine that we are creating cannot use more than 2 GB of memory. So I'll leave it as it is and I'll move ahead. Now I don't have any network created. Network in Hyper-V are known as switches. So I currently do not have any Hyper-V switches created or any network created, so I'm not adding it. So I'll leave it to not connected. And I'll move ahead. So here we have an option to create a new hard disk, to attach a hard disk later, or to use an existing hard disk. Let's suppose you have an existing virtual hard disk and you want to use it in some you want to create a new virtual machine and you want to use that existing hard disk, then you can use this second option, or you can create and attach a virtual hard disk later once you have created the virtual machine. I will select this option because I do not have any existing hard disk, so I will just go ahead and create a new hard disk. I will reduce this size to 40 GB because we are just creating, I'm just showing you how we can create a virtual machine inside Hyper-V. So this is just for demo purposes, so I will use 40 GB. Now move to next, and here I can select installation media. So I can either select the operating system later, so I can just create the virtual machine now and then select the operating system later, and or I can add the bootable image here. So since I already have the image file, so I will just browse it and I'll add it here. So I have the image file inside my downloads, so I'll just select it here. So the image file is updated, and now I'll go to next and then finish. So this is the virtual machine that is created. So let's try to connect this and see how this works. before doing that, I'll just want to show you that inside VMs, we have a folder VM01 created. Inside this folder, we will have the virtual hard disks and the virtual machine. So whatever hard disk that I have attached, the VHDX file, you will find it inside the virtual hard disk. This is already created, although this is a blank hard disk right now. It doesn't have any, it doesn't has anything, but it is created here. And then we have the virtual machine where it shows the VMCS files. That's it. So now let's go ahead and install the operating system. To install the operating system, I'll just click, first I will go to settings of the virtual machine. From here, under firmware, you can select the sequence in which you want your virtual machine to boot. So if you have added a DVD drive, you can use the virtual machine to boot from a DVD drive. If you have, let's suppose you have an environment which allows you to perform boot operations using network adapters, then you can use this. Or if you have the operating system already installed, then by default the boot order changes and the first one is the hard drive. Right now we will leave it as it is because we want the machine to boot from the DVD drive that I have attached. So I'll just click OK, and here I'll click to start. So the virtual machine has started successfully. Okay, so we get this error. Let me try to reset this. Restart here. So it gave a short prompt which said press any key to start booting from CDD or DVD drive. So I did that, and then here the Windows setup has started. So let's click on next and install now. So now the setup will start to install, and because I have used a business version, so it gives me all the different types of options that we can use. So let's take an example. My host virtual machine, as I already showed you earlier, was a Windows 10 Enterprise. So let's try to install a Windows 10 Pro on this virtual machine, inside this particular virtual machine that we have created. So we'll go to next. And next. And because we do not have anything, it's a blank installation. So I'll just go ahead, create new, and I'll hit apply. So this basically enables us to create partitions. Since this is just a test machine, so I am not going to create any partition here. But if you want, you can go ahead and do that. So I'll just select the primary partition and I'll hit next. And now the machine has started the installation. This process, this entire feeling that it gives to the user who is doing the deployment is exactly similar to what a user might face when he or she tries to install an operating system on a physical infrastructure. The only difference being, right now this machine is located inside another machine which is hosted in a physical data center somewhere in this world. So that is the big difference. So this is the concept, the basic concept of nested virtualization. Let's give it a few minutes. Let the machine turn on, get the operating system installed and turn on, and then we will look into how the machine looks like actually. So now you can see that we are here on this page. So let's get ahead and select this. So I'll go with United States, click on yes. It's asking for a keyboard layout, so I'll just leave it to default, click on yes. I don't want to add a second keyboard layout, so I'll just skip it. And this will try to search for a network, but I currently have not given any network access while I was configuring the virtual machine. So I'll just go with I do not have internet. And then I'll just continue with limited setup. We can always go ahead and add internet later. So I'll just add a name here for a user. This is the local user that is being created. I'll just add a password. Next, these are some things that you will require. So let me add this. So these are security questions that you will require to answer here. And this entire experience is something that you will get when this entire experience is something that you will get when you perform the same activity, like you try to install operating system, the same Windows 10 operating system on the physical hardware. So the experience is more or less same. The only difference being that we are not doing the same things on the physical hardware, but we are doing it on a virtual software. And this is something that is done inside an existing virtual machine. So with this, now you can understand that we have successfully deployed a particular virtual machine, a Windows 10 virtual machine, a Windows 10 Pro virtual machine inside a Windows 10 Enterprise virtual machine. The host machine operating system has nothing to do with the virtual machine operating system. Both are separate entities. We can add internet connectivity. The network would be shared within the host machine and the virtual machine. So internet access can be given to this machine. We are not going to look into that for this demo right now. Whatever action we need to perform, we can do it, we can perform inside this. So if you want to create any lab infrastructure, if you want to create more than one virtual machine inside a single Azure virtual machine, you can do that. So with this, we come to the end of this video. We talked about virtualization, we talked about nested virtualization, and you saw a short demo about how we can perform nested virtualization within an Azure virtual machine. Do like, share and subscribe to our video, and if you have any questions, do leave your questions under the comment section, and I would try to answer all of your questions. Thank you.